if we want to understand Jerome's polemic with Evagrius correctly, we should put it into the broader context of his polemic with Pelagians. Over the centuries, this dispute, known as the Pelagian controversy, has been seen as essentially concerned with the nature of grace, while other issues of theological anthropology and soteriology, such as baptism, free will, and predestination, has been considered as a secondary. That is due to the Augustine influence and his lenses. And you can say that the Professor Bonner already in the 70s said that Pelagian controversy has been seen through Augustine's lenses. Jerome Bonner already in the 70s has distinguished between theological heresy and historical controversy. He claims that the word Pelagianism is used by dogmatic theologians to describe the heresy which dispenses with any need of divine grace and denies any transmission of original sin. The second definition is Pelagianism as an ascetic movement within the Christian Church during the late 4th and 5th centuries, a movement composed of disparate elements which came in the course of time to be associated under the name of Pelagius. Michael Reckitt, in his dissertation titled Sexuality and Sinless, said that the central theological problem which united the diverse Pelagian movement was the affirmation of the possibility of sinless. Even if by replacing the central question of grace with the central question of sinless, Reckitt falls into the same reductionist trap as the previous scholars, nevertheless he rightly drew the attention of scholars to the idea of sinless. We know that Jerome, like Cassian, was one of the most important ascetic writers for the West in the early Church, but contrary to Clark, who claims that he viewed this debate as a continuation of both the ascetic and Origenist controversies, he did not see this debate through the ascetic lens, and that's a very important point which I want to underline. Even in his epistle 130, which was one of the most important discourses on the consecrated life, and where one would expect a connection between asceticism and Pelagius to be made, his warning to Demetrius was restricted to the danger of the Origenism, such as the preexistence of souls in the new form, but did not accuse Pelagius of rejecting moral hierarchy, which was the center of the ascetic concerns. Perhaps he did not detect any ascetic shading in Pelagius' writings, despite the fact that the bishops of the Synod of Diospolis had done so and addressed Pelagius as a monk several times. Perhaps Jerome had not known this, but did not see the implication for the ascetic life that Pelagius' arguments inevitably seized. First reference to Evagrius, what I want to say is that even if he criticized Evagrius, he didn't put this argumentation in the context of the ascetic movement. Pelagianism seen as an ascetic movement, but as an Origenist controversy always. That's very important. For the first time, he attacks Evagrius in Epistula 133, Epistula Ctesifontem, written in 414, probably. Jerome had written this letter presenting his opinion on 2 points in the teaching on Pelagius, his quietism, would say, and his denial of original sin. Jerome, of course, refuted these 2 doctrines and points out that Pelagius had drawn them partially from the philosophers and partially from the heretics. The philosophers are particularly, of course, Stoics, Pythagoras and Zeno, the founder of Stoic school. The Stoics affirm that it is possible to root out of the human mind what they call patience, ἀπαθεία in Greek. All vice may be destroyed, root and branch in man by meditation on virtue and constant practice of it. To maintain such a doctrine is to make man's nature from him, to forget that he is constituted of body as well as the soul, and to substitute mere wishes for sound teaching. The heretics, inspired by Greek philosophers, say that the man may be without sin, sine peccato, if you will describe this state by Greek with anamartos, sinless. As such a state sounds intolerable to the Eastern, that I quote German words. To Eastern churches, they profess indeed only to say that the man may be without sin, and do not presume to allege that he may be sinless as well. And he quotes later Manichaeans, Priscillians from Spain, especially, and also Gnostics before Basilides, which were followed by Evagrius and then Iovinian. And I quote, Evagrius of Ibera in Pontus, who sends letters to the virgins and monks, and among others to her, whose name bears witness to the blackness of her perfidy, that's Mirania, you know, has published a book of Maxis on ἀπαθεία, or as we should say, impassivity, a state in which the mind ceases to be agitated and speak simply becomes either stone or God. That's the famous phrases of Jerome. His work is widely read in the East, in Greek, and in the West in the Latin translation made by his disciple Rufinus. He has also written a book which professed to be about monks and included the many not monks and to all who declares to have been Origenists, and who have certainly been condemned by the bishops. I mean Ammonius, Eusebius, Euthymius, the long brothers, Evagrius himself, Scaurus, and Isidorus. Jerome adds that if the arguments of these people and also Pelagius would be rational, man would have no external need from God's grace to avoid sin. So there is no need to fast or any other form of self-restraint. Pelagius argumented that if human will requires external support, it ceases to be a free will. They criticize Orthodox Christians to destroy free will. To save human freedom, we have to admit that we are no longer dependent on God. Jerome tried to convince Ctesiphon that human free will requires the help of God's grace. If in the Holy Scriptures men are called righteous, as Zechariah or Elizabeth, they at the same time Scripture clearly says that they committed a lot of errors and sins before they complete conversion to God. Second text is a prologue on the commentary to the Jeremiah chapter 4, and it basically repeated the same text. Stoics, Pythagoras and Zeno, and then Origen, his disciple Evagrius, Ponticus and Iovinian. This heresy became known not only in East but also in West, and some islands like Sicily and Rhodes. It stained many people and has grown from day to day because heretics teach it in secret and deny publicly. Dum secreto docent et publice negant. And the third text we find in Dialogi contra Pelagianus, written in 415, 17 or 19. It is a Socratic dialogue between two fictional characters, Atticus, as Jerome's voice, and Christobulus, Pelagius' voice. And the text developed the arguments presented already in Epistula 133. In fact, in Epistula 133 and the Dialogi contra Pelagianus book 1st and 2nd, Jerome states that one may not be sinless, but, and that is interesting, in the third book of Dialogi, probably under the influence of Augustine, he curiously departs from his previous statement, adding that one may be sinless due to the individual effort, ascetic effort, of course. Jerome allows for the efficacy of the free will to avoid the traps of sin according to the individual personal strength and surrounding temptations. He does not allow, however, this sinless to remain in a permanent state because no matter how strong the will or how few the temptations are, one may not avoid sin for the entire life, but only for a short time. Jerome did not allow that in first and second book of Dialogi, and this change stems from the rejections of Augustine's position on sinlessness. Jerome, meantime, read in Augustine's work on theology that he considered to be too pessimistic about the human condition. He felt the need to offer a theological position that attributed more agency to the individual in order to counteract the limitations that Augustine places on the will because of original sin. Jerome's main weapon of the attack on Pelagius' theory of sinlessness was to paint him as an intellectual descendant of heterodox Christians who infected Christianity with non-Christian ideas. In prologue to Dialogue, Jerome repeats the same arguments he presented, as I said, in the letter 133. I skip it because we have no time. And he mentions new academics, Peripatetics, Gnostics, Basilides, Priscillian, Evagrius, Christus, Messalians, Mani, Arians, and Mercian. He felt that if he could connect Pelagius' idea of sinlessness through origin back to the Greek philosophy, that he would be able to discredit his opponent and win the day. He offers the definition of sinlessness that he sees operating in Pelagius' work, which he believes is rooted in Stoicism. According to the Stoics, as I said, every individual experience, passions, pathe, perturbatio, that must be removed from meditation on virtue and constant practice of it, exercitatio. If one were ever to achieve this goal, he sees such a person becoming either stone or a god, as I said. Jerome then connects the supposed Stoic idea with Pelagius' belief in the possibility of stillness. And if he puts Evagrius on the same line with Stoics and other heretics, as Jerome scholars pointed out, description of ἀπαθεία is a little more, I quote Driver, description of ἀπαθεία is little more than the caricature, and his supposed reliance on the ancient philosophers shows that Jerome had little understanding of their view. Furthermore, even if Jerome had a quite clear understanding of Stoic definition of ἀπαθεία, he didn't know the writings of Evagrius well enough to realize how Evagrius had adopted the term for Christian use, by making it means towards the end of the prayerful connection together. Cassian, on this point, at least understood Evagrius better than Jerome. Both Cassian and Jerome rejected Pelagius' idea of sinlessness, but they did so from opposite positions. Cassian stood firmly on an Evagrian foundation, while Jerome rejected Pelagius for an anti-Evagrian position. For Cassian, Pelagius was, as we can say, not Evagrian enough, while Jerome thought that Pelagius was too Evagrian. What was the central importance was their relationship with Greek philosophy and the Christian appropriation of that philosophy. This relationship corroborated their rejection of Pelagius, Cassian with dependence on Evagrius and his praise of a certain practice of Egyptian fathers constructed a definition of sinlessness that echoed Skopos of the desert moon. In the context of dispute with Jovinian and Pelagian controversy, Jerome understood the Greek term ἀπαθεία used by Evagrius as a state of complete absence of any movement in the soul of man, a kind of divine state. In the contemporary research on Evagrius, thanks to the discovery of many of these texts preserved in Greek under the name of Nero van Syra, a Syrian translation of his writing, we are able to reconstruct better his understanding of impassibility. Coming back to Evagrius, we see that he divided the spiritual life of man into stages, practice and gnostike. And practice is basically fight with 8 logismoi, or patience. And gnostike is a contemplation of Holy Trinity. So practice is a fight with gluttony, impurity, avarice, sadness, anger, acedia, sloth, vainglory, and pride. Evagrius, on one side, defined impassibilitas uprooting or removing all patience from the soul, from the other, as just limiting their impact. So the scholars propose that when Evagrius was talking about uprooting or removing of all patience, he had in mind the monastic life. And speaking to the beginners, he invited them just to limit impact. Evagrius was talking about imperfect impassibility and perfect impassibility. Imperfect is just limitation of the influence of one patient, and perfect, possible to be achieved by only by monks, is to oppose to every one of these eight patients. Jerome identified impassibility with the lack of any emotion or desire in the Stoic sense. However, we must remember that Jerome saw the sources of both Arianism and Pelagianism in origin, and from the perspective of these assumptions he interpreted the teachings of Evagrius about impassibility. As we will see, not quite properly. So he mistakenly identified impassibility with impeccantia and impassibilitas, accusing Evagrius of wanting to make man heartless stone or sinless God. Vel saxum, vel deus est. Evagrius, as we know, did not identify impassibility with the state of modern apathy, a kind of insensitivity, or psychologically speaking, with denial or repression of feelings and emotions. If he claimed that love is a doctor of impassibility, he assumed that there was still some emotional component in that state. Further, he clearly distinguished between desire impulses and passions. The former, which although they were gained to man only after the original fall when God gave him a bodily structure, are authentically good and morally neutral, while the later, though in themselves are neutral, are the result of man's decision to use desires and impulses inconsistently with their nature. They are subject to moral evaluation. According to Evagrius, impassibility consists in freeing oneself from passion, because it is impossible to free oneself from the desires, and so distinction is very important with these impulses, and desires and passions. Because it is impossible to be completely free, impossible to free oneself from the desires as impulses that is in present stand belong to human nature. Jerome did not understand this subtle distinction, or the teachings of Evagrius had already reached him in some changed form, we don't know. Since he identified impassibility of a will to free oneself from natural desires and impulses. While on the one hand, the lack of distinction between desires, impulses, and passions leads to the identification of impassibility with insensivity, an attempt to make a man of stone, on the other, identification of patience with sin leads to understanding of impassibility as the sinlessness, as divine state. It is worth remembering that Jerome used the term impeccantia, that in his time, as Bunge rightly pointed out, meant Pelagian teaching about possibility of achieving the state of sinlessness only on man's own strength without God's help. He applied these Pelagian glasses to the Evagrian concept of impassibility, saying it needed the influence of Origen and the source of Pelagian heresy. The absurdity of this accusation becomes evident if you remember that Evagrius is inspired by Clement of Alexandria, not Origen, because Origen used the Greek term ἀπαθεία very rarely. And Jerome did not fully understand the teaching of Evagrius on this subject, mixing it with the Stoic idea of dissipation and the Pelagian doctrine of sinlessness. Pelagians themselves, by identifying ἀπαθεία with impeccantia, prepare in some way the wrong way to the idea itself, and the term that later Christian authors such as Chrétiennes will avoid at all costs, replacing it with puritas cordis. In the spiritual doctrine of Evagrius, however, impassibility does not mean neither stoic-like of any desire or insensitivity, nor sinlessness understood in the Pelagian way, that is, achieved only by ascetic effort alone. There is no doubt that according to the monk of Pontus, ascetic practice, although it is a spiritual method of purifying the passionate part of the soul, remains ineffective with God's grace. Impassibility, according to Evagrius, would be liberation from evil passions, that is, from use of desires as impulses against their nature, and not the lack of any patience at all. Evagrius defines such a state as a health of soul, and if we were to describe the use of desires as impulses contrary to the nature, impassibility would be the liberation from such a sinful use. Such a state is possible for men here on earth, but it is never absolutely permanent. Even if Jerome has quoted some of Evagrian works, we have no traces that he read something of this text. Probably the critics of Evagrius is an echo of his critique against Origen and Rufinus. Thank you very much.